Kumudini Pati, an independent researcher, and I am going to present a module on behalf of Professor Sanjay Datta Roy from the University of Allahabad and Ms. Fatima Noori, who is also a researcher. The subject we are taking up is Women's Studies, and this is paper 15, The Stories the States Tell. And we are taking up module number 27, which is about terrorism and militarism in Kashmir and its impact on women. Now, the oppression that has been going on in Kashmir is something which we are going to discuss in detail. So, you have to have a background of what actually has been happening in the valley. The valley of Kashmir has been called the Switzerland of India, although people who have traveled across both Europe and Kashmir may find Kashmir's beauty much more captivating. Kashmir's beauty is also seen in their poetry. For example, one of the oldest women poets of India, Laleshwari, who has been from Kashmir from 14th century, has also been a great writer and has been writing in Kashmiri tongue. Now, the beautiful land of chinars and the saffron fields has also produced the singer Habba Khatun of the 16th century, whose songs have struck the popular imagination of the people. The land of Kashmir held not only immense physical beauty, but also had a very beautiful character. It should be noted that it is one of the rare states where gender discrimination was rarely visible. Now, what was actually the cause of oppression in Kashmir has to be understood. The situation of women in any society is largely dependent on the socio-political conditions of that land. In most Indian societies, it is the religious and cultural practices that determine the position and the treatment of women. And there are many written and unwritten rules which are actually implemented, and we will see these have been violated, the constitution has been violated, and treatment has been very unjust and biased as regards women. The women of Kashmir have been facing unjust treatment after the post 1947 political turmoil. In the entire political game, women, due to their physical vulnerabilities and the low level of education, had become tools and soft targets in the hands of both the army as well as the separatist militants. A look at one of the tables which has been presented here will reveal that the state of Jammu and Kashmir did have a fair sex ratio, but a very low literacy rate. So, in this table, we are comparing 1981 to 2011. Now, if we take the population, the male population is 31,64,660, and in 1981, the female population is 28,22,729. In 2011, we see that the population increases, the male population becomes 66,40,662, whereas for females it becomes 59,640. Now, we go to the total population. In 1981, it is 59,87,389, and in 2011, it is 1.25 crores. Literacy, if we see the literacy in 1981, it is 41.46% for males, and for females, it is just 18.37%. And when we compare it to 2011, we see that it is 76.75% for the males and 56.43% for females. And similarly, when we see the total literacy rate in 1981, it is 30.64%, and we see 2011, it has increased to 67.16%. Now, the sex ratio in 1981 was 892 for 1,000 males, and it became 889. It is a slight drop in 2011. Now, when we go to the historical background of the land, we see that the Kashmir turmoil of the 1990s was an important event, not only just politically, but socially also, as it had deep repercussions on the social and the psychological makeup of the people who were associated with this land. But what was even worse was the destruction of the rich heritage and the syncretic culture that was the quintessential Kashmiriyat, as we call it, with the Islamic purists infiltrating the land and the culture of the valley and their mindless suppression by the Indian military. The paradise on earth, as Kashmir used to be famously called, had turned into hell. The lives of both those who were robbed of their lands and with it a dignified living, and also of those who had stayed behind, turned into nightmares with living in refugee camps, trauma of the loss of their homes and family, no source of living, and the incessant military operations, the combing operations of their houses, and all this kind of random thing that was going on in the state. Now, what was the condition of the women? If you see a brief revision of the political scenario of the land, we will understand the social makeup of the people and especially its women. The state of Jammu and Kashmir largely consists of three regions: the province of Jammu, the valley of Kashmir, and the Ladakh region. The Gilgit-Baltistan and the Azad Kashmir regions are mostly controlled by Pakistan, whereas the other part, which is the Aksai Chin, has been taken over by China. Now, it is the geography of Kashmir that creates trouble. When India became independent, it allowed the princely states the choice of accession to either Pakistan or to India. Kashmir's ruler, who was Raja Hari Singh, wanted to stay independent. It was such a situation that this kind of a situation was either be with India or with Pakistan, which was neither liked nor disliked. Now, Pakistan made claims to the land, as the valley of Kashmir largely consisted of a Muslim population. So, naturally they felt that since the majority was a Muslim population, Pakistan should naturally have a right over it. There had already been a movement against the Dogra Hindu rulers. Raja Hari Singh in 1931 was the ruler, and again in 1946 it was led by Sheikh Abdullah, who wanted freedom from the oppressive monarchy, and he wanted the establishment of some kind of a secular democratic state. Now, what was the post-independence scene? When India gained freedom in August 1947, Kashmir stayed independent till October 1947, when on 26th day of the month, Raja Hari Singh signed the instrument of accession ceding Kashmir to India, as he was fearing that the Pakistani tribal invaders would come and capture Srinagar and dethrone him. Now, Pakistan and India entered into their first war, as Pakistan refused to recognize the treaty. The war ended in 1948, when the United Nations actually intervened on India's insistence and asked Pakistani tribal army to move out of Kashmir. India was also to demilitarize the land, and Pandit Nehru agreed to the UNCIP's, that is the United Nations Commission for India and Pakistan's proposition of holding a plebiscite to decide about the future of the state. Now, it is very sad that the plebiscite which was supposed to be held was never held, and both the parties could not come to any kind of peace agreement. So, Pakistan withheld the areas that it had captured, and then it was also known as Azad Kashmir. Meanwhile, Sheikh Abdullah was made the Prime Minister of the interim government in October 1948, and there was a ceasefire which was declared on the 1st of January 1949. This till date remains the line of control. In October 1949, India adopted the Article 370, which was granting Kashmir some kind of a special status with internal autonomy except in the matters of defense, communication and external affairs. And from this time on, the politics of that area becomes tumultuous. Now, Sheikh Abdullah, who was previously supporting Kashmir's accession to India, started turning hostile and demanded freedom for the state. He was arrested in 1953, and Bakshi Ghulam Muhammad was appointed as the new head of the state. India also started changing its stance, and the stand became from allowing the people of Kashmir the choice of accession to starting to maintain that Kashmir was an integral part of India. Now, we will talk about the Indo-Pakistan War. Another war in 1965 also occurred between the two nations, and the situation worsened in 1971. India helping in the partition of East and West Pakistan was seen very clearly. By the 1980s, the activists were clamoring for independent Kashmir. You must have heard a lot of people talking about independent Kashmir. There have been also protests against the Indian government, and many of them have been engineered by the JKLF, that is the Jammu Kashmir Liberation Front. Kashmir has been burning since then. The conflict remains unresolved. Lots of lives have been claimed by the conflict. People have been displaced, people have disappeared and never returned. So, there is some kind of gross injustice and large scale human rights violations, and during this time women have been suffering the most. So, when women have been suffering this kind of violence, we see that the case of victimization in Kashmir is very serious. It should be borne in mind that both the men and women are victims of a complex political situation in the state. Actually, they themselves do not want violence, but the kind of situation that is prevailing in Kashmir is forcing them to face this kind of violence. So, the people have a dream of Azadi. The Azadi slogan has become the main slogan for them, and they have become, especially the women have become very vulnerable to the machinations of the masters of the state. Now, women, who are the so called weaker sex, stand doubly disadvantaged. One is the victimization of the women in the state, which is intricately and inextricably linked with the political situation there, and the other is, as women already they are the weaker sex. The women of Kashmir have been victims of both the state's authoritarian measures translated into physical and sexual offences against them, as well as of the fake militants who emerged after 1990. This was the 1990 insurgency that we are talking about. And after this 1990 insurgency, the situation became even more complex. The victimization of women took place in several different ways with the changing political scenario. Initially, when the movement for independence started in 1989, there were violent confrontations between the army and the locals who were supporters of the cause of independent Kashmir. A huge number of missing men led to the case of widows and half widows, as they are called, which were a situation where these women actually did not know where their husbands were, because they were missing from their homes, but actually where they were and what they were doing was not known to these women. According to the official Indian sources, there have been more than 50,000 people who died and around 10,000 people who went missing during a span of 2 decades from 1989 to 2000 in the Kashmir conflict. The unofficial sources also claim some 1 lakh men killed during 1989 to 2005 and 15,000 who disappeared into nowhere. Of this, the majority were actually married people. So, the women were forced into widowhood. Now, forced widowhoods entailed the added task of finding a new source of livelihood, because the breadwinner had actually gone. So, besides finishing all the household chores and looking after children, women were having to earn a livelihood so that their families could be sustained. Women who were aware of their widowed status were better off than the half widows, because the half widows were trying all the time to find out where their husbands had gone when they went missing, and sometimes it was for years that they saw them not returning at all. They had to keep making regular visits to the army camps and offices to inquire about their husbands, where these women were themselves harassed by the army men who suspected that their husbands or their sons, who were the disappeared men from their family, might be militants who had gone hiding. Now, there is a case of mass rape also, which had gone on in Kashmir. It is a big story now in the media. As the politics of the land was becoming more and more complex, the dialogues were heated and the actions became more and more brutal. There emerged a reported tradition of mass rapes. The first such incident occurred in 1990 in Chandpura of Srinagar, where the army withheld the men of the house outside on the pretext of searching illegal arms, whereas actually inside the women of the family were being mass raped. The lonely women were then allegedly raped inside their own houses. This became some kind of a pattern of the army raids. The army frequently started using rape as a weapon against the women, and it became a kind of punishment to the men of the valley who had been rebelling against the Indian government. So, you can say that instead of engaging with the people on a political basis, rape became some kind of a tool or a weapon to suppress the movements of the Kashmiri people. The most notorious episode became the Kunan Pushpora rape case, which took place on the night of February 23rd of 1991. Here 30 women were allegedly raped by an army unit. This episode had invited a lot of media attention, and also it became an international media event. This forced the Indian government to start some kind of an inquiry by using the Press Council, which was a non-government body. The army's internal inquiry as well as the council rubbished this whole episode as a mere fabrication to defame the army. The locals still, however, claim that routine tortures, abductions, sexual assaults and rape of women of all ages is going on taking place. Now, there are several ways in which the women suffer, and we will also see that there are certain social implications to these. Like for example, to maintain the identity of Kashmiri people, especially the Muslims, there is this custom of veiling. It is a kind of parda which is deliberately imposed on the women. There is an additional burden on the women to take care of those who are wounded, injured, or the people who have become old in the family, and also to act at the same time as breadwinners for the family. Paltry compensations are given. Maximum is 1 lakh rupees, and that can take care of them for a few months, and after that again they are in the same situation. There are several legal issues also that come up when they claim the compensation. Actually, you have to prove that you are a widow or you are a half widow in order to get a compensation. Then there are many psychological repercussions also. For example, there is a trauma and a post-traumatic stress disorder which the women have to face. Women become a tool both in the hands of the army as well as of the militants, and then women are raped, and many times they are even branded as mukhbirs or as informers. So, this is perhaps because the population of the state actually consists of a majority of Muslims, that is 65% are Muslims. This was at the time of partition, and around only 15% were Hindus. The Kashmiri Pandits, as the Hindus of the valleys were called, were mostly the landowners, and they were the people who were educated, while the Muslim population was mainly involved in toil, in some kind of agricultural work or animal husbandry or handicrafts or different kinds of other activities which were on a lower rung of the society. So, we can say that women in those days were taking part in the commercial interests of the state, and they were very actively involved in all the commercial activities that were going on. The vexed situation of Kashmir, to sum up, we can say, demands a sincere and a pro-people political solution. It does not want a brutal military answer. Thank you.